Do you know the difference between تاني مرة, المرة الثانية, and مرة تانية? Why doesn't تاني agree with مرة in the first one? And how can تاني مرة be the same as المرة الثانية, but not the same as مرة تانية? How come the big bus is الباص الكبير, but the last bus is آخر باص? And how do you say something like the thing I like to do the most? We're going to unpack all of this and more today as we discuss elative adjectives. Adjectives that convey both a comparative and a superlative meaning all in one. So let's get started. Hey everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. In today's video, we're going to talk about adjectives. Recently, I realized that I've never actually made a video about adjectives in general because their use is quite simple and I basically explained it in my video on the definite article. But just to review, there are three things you need to know to attach an adjective to a noun. First, adjectives in Arabic go after the noun they modify, such as بيت كبير, a big house. Second, they must correspond in gender and number with the noun, like سيارة جديدة, a new car, or بيوت كبيرة, big houses. Notice that plural agreement usually just means making the adjective feminine, since non-human plurals are all treated as feminine in Arabic. However, if you were actually talking about people, it would be ولد منيح versus بنت منيحة versus أولاد مناح. And third, adjectives must correspond in definiteness as well, meaning that if the noun is definite in any way, whether it's indicated by the article, possession, or the إضافة construction, then the adjective must also be marked as definite by using the article il. Hence, البيت الكبير, the big house, بيتي الكبير, my big house, or بيت أحمد الكبير, Ahmad's big house, in which بيت أحمد is a definite إضافة phrase, which internally is made up of an indefinite noun followed by a definite noun. This last point is really important, because even though the word بيت by itself would be indefinite, as in بيت كبير, since the entire phrase بيت أحمد is definite, the adjective modifying it must be definite as well. Now can you try to say the old city of Jerusalem? The syntax is very different from English because the adjective is at the very end, after the إضافة construction. So it would be بلدة القدس القديمة, in which بلدة is indefinite, but بلدة القدس is definite, and therefore القديمة must be definite as well. There's one last thing worth restating since it will be useful to know for the next session. Adjectives only correspond in definiteness with the noun when they are attributive, meaning when they're connected to the noun within a single noun phrase, as in بيت كبير or بلدة القدس القديمة. Otherwise, when they're predicative, as in the house is big rather than the big house, they're always indefinite without the article attached. That's why it's really important to use the article correctly. Phrases like البيت كبير or even بلدة القدس قديمة are not wrong per se, it's just that they're nominal sentences with predicative adjectives, not noun phrases with attributive adjectives. Okay, now we need to talk about the other type of adjective in Arabic, the elative adjective. First, a quick word about its form. You can easily tell that something is an elative adjective if it has the form أفعل, as in أكبر, أصغر, أكتر, and أقل. Oh yes, if the third letter of the root is repeated, you just add شدة. So قليل, أقل, جديد, أجد. Likewise, if the last letter is missing altogether, well, you just leave it blank. غالي, أغلى, حلو, أحلى. Notice that the original form of the adjective doesn't really matter either. Anyway, as I mentioned before, an elative adjective is an adjective that conveys both the comparative meaning, like bigger, and a superlative meaning, like biggest. But which meaning it has depends a little bit on how it's used. When the elative is used as a predicative adjective, it has a comparative meaning. For instance, البيت كبير, the house is big. البيت أكبر, the house is bigger. This use of the elative goes hand in hand with min, as in البيت أكبر من هيك, the house is bigger than that. So the predicative use of elative adjectives is pretty much just like the use of ordinary Arabic adjectives, and indeed just like the use of the comparative in English. As for their use as attributive adjectives connected to the noun itself, the story is a little bit trickier. If the elative goes after the noun, again like a regular adjective, the meaning is simply comparative. بدي بيت أكبر, I want a bigger house. However, if the elative goes before the noun, the meaning is superlative. بدي أكبر بيت, I want the biggest house. The most interesting thing about this minimal pair is actually not that the meaning is comparative in one and superlative in the other, but rather that it's indefinite in one and definite in the other, even though the adjective itself has not taken the article or changed in form in any way. So how can that be? That's because in Arabic, an elative adjective with a superlative meaning inherently refers to something definite. Even in English, it doesn't really make sense to use a superlative adjective for an indefinite noun, like a biggest house. It doesn't really make sense. Likewise, since akbar as a superlative inherently refers to the biggest thing, adding an article would be redundant, like saying the biggest house. So that's why akbar bayt without any article already means the biggest house. But note that it's only when the elative has a superlative meaning that it's placed before the noun and makes the entire noun phrase definite. Whereas as we saw in the case of il bayt kabir versus il bayt akbar, the comparative use of the elative actually works basically just like a regular adjective, meaning it should technically correspond in gender, number, and definiteness with the noun. However, I say technically for a reason. Compare bayt kabir and bayt akbar. If you want to turn bayt kabir into a definite phrase, just attach the article to the noun to the adjective to get il bayt likbir. Technically, you can turn bayt akbar into il bayt il akbar in the same way, but this type of phrase is actually not very common. Why? Because for all practical purposes, the bigger house is pragmatically equivalent to the biggest one, akbar bayt. And since they're the same, the comparative neatness of akbar bayt makes it preferable over il bayt il akbar. What do I mean by neatness? Well, remember that elative adjectives can be either used before the noun as inherently definite attributive superlatives or as attributive or predicative comparatives that function just like regular adjectives. But since both attributive superlatives and predicative adjectives never take the definite article, the only case where an elative could possibly take the article is in the case of definite attributive comparatives like il bayt il akbar, which as I've just shown is already pragmatically equivalent to akbar bayt, and therefore the entire existence of this phrasing is basically redundant. This is compounded by the fact that elatives as superlatives never ever correspond in gender and number with the noun, as in akbar bayt and ahsan sayyara. Because while technically elatives as comparatives should function as normal adjectives, in this regard, they've actually lost their inflections in the dialect already. Hence you have bayt kabir, bayt akbar, and bayti akbar. But sayyara mniha becomes sayyara ahsan and sayyarti ahsan. This just makes the structure of is sayyara il ahsan, which inflects for definiteness but not gender and number, seem even more strange, while the correct form is sayyara il husna is just comically formal. So there's a lot of pressure to eliminate the really marginal, superfluous, and grammatically problematic case of the definite attributive comparative in favor of the much neater superlative structure ahsan sayyara, eventually leading to a state of affairs in which the elative becomes a completely static form that never inflects for anything. Okay, now that we've established all that, I can answer some of the questions I asked at the start of the video. I asked you why the big bus is il bas likbir, but the last bus is akhir bas. Well, the structure of akhir bas should look familiar to you by now. You see, all the ordinal terms work grammatically like elatives, from awwal, the first, to akhir, the last. Just like akbar bas is inherently the biggest bus, akhir bas is the last bus. No article is needed. And just like bus akbar is a bigger bus, bus akhir is a later bus. I think now I've also given you the answer to the tani marra conundrum. Now you can see why tani marra is pragmatically the same as il marra it-taniya, while marra taniya is structurally the same as il marra it-taniya, but indefinite. Do note that although ordinal numbers can work grammatically like elatives because they inherently refer to something specific, they are actually just regular adjectives, meaning they're not so resistant to the structure of il marra it-taniya, and you can see they even inflect for gender. I would still say the structure is comparatively more formal, especially in the case of awwal and akhir. Il marra il-ula is just really unnecessarily formal, so do say awwal marra. So those are the basics you need to know to use elative adjectives correctly, but let's try some more advanced phrases. Let's start by comparing two simple sentences. First we have shuftu marra taniya, I saw him a second time. By the way, tani literally means second, but by extension it means another. So marra taniya is actually like saying once more or again. In this sentence, tani is structurally analogous to an attributive comparative, as in akbar in bayt akbar. So marra taniya is a single indefinite noun phrase, which in turn is functionally an adverb meaning again. Thus, I saw him again. The second sentence is tani marra shuftu, the next time I saw him. The words are almost exactly the same, and yet, first of all, this is not even a complete sentence. The entire thing is actually just one definite noun phrase, in which the verb shufto is a relative clause giving additional information about marra. It's the next time that I saw him. Notice that there's no definite article anywhere to be seen, because thani is acting grammatically like a superlative elative here, making the entire phrase inherently definite. If you're very observant, you may be asking yourself why the word illi seems to be missing. Illi is the word used to initiate a relative clause, similar to that in English, as in الزلمة اللي شفته, the guy that I saw. But while that is optional in English, in Arabic, illi is not optional. It must be used, but only if the noun phrase is definite. If the noun phrase is indefinite, then it must not be used. So a guy I saw is just زلمة شفته. So what about تاني مرة شفته? If the use of تاني makes it a definite phrase, why isn't illi used? That's because شفته is a relative clause, but it's not a relative clause of the definite noun تاني مرة. It's a relative clause of the indefinite noun مرة. The word تاني is not affecting مرة directly, but rather it's encompassing the entire phrase مرة شفته and making it definite. Since مرة شفته by itself is indefinite, no illi is used. Not only would مرة illi شفته be ungrammatical, but if you said المرة اللي شفته after تاني, it would be just as ungrammatical as saying أكبر البيت or the biggest house. So to summarize, the elative adjective comes first, and then the entire noun phrase encompassed by it must be an entirely indefinite phrase, with the outcome being a single definite unit. It's kind of like إضافة, where the first part of the structure must be indefinite, but the addition of the second part, the definite noun, results in a single definite unit. I know I'm explaining it in painstaking detail, but the way to really learn this is by actually seeing it and just absorbing it and getting used to it. I'm just trying to save you some of the headache of trying to figure out why it's this and not that, because it definitely doesn't make sense at first glance. Again, remember that تاني مرة شفته is not even a full sentence. A full sentence would be تاني مرة شفته قلت له لا. The next time I saw him, I told him no. It may seem weird to have two verbs back to back like that if you don't understand which one is doing what, how, and why. And this is not a marginal structure by any means. It's really common to use elatives in general, precisely because of all the uses that they can have. Just look at the last thing I mentioned at the start of the video. How would you say the song I like to sing the most? Your instinct might be to start with الأغنية, اللي, but we should actually be starting with the elative, أكثر, the most. And everything that is nested beneath it must be a single indefinite unit. أغنية بحب أغنيها, a song I like to sing. أكثر أغنية بحب أغنيها, the song I like to sing the most. You see, it really can be tricky and even nonsensical if you don't really know what everything is doing and who is nesting what in the sentence. So, now you do. I should really leave it at that, although I've definitely covered everything you need to know about the elative adjective in the dialect. Maybe even more than you needed to know. But you can always come back to this video later if you want a refresher. As I said, you won't really learn by watching grammar videos. At the end of the day, you should do other things like reading the annotated transcripts that I've made, where you can see how people use these common structures in real life. So go do your homework, and I'll see you next time.